Is that better? Is that it? Hello? Good.
Let's start again from the beginning.
Yes. That's the first time anybody's used the phrase perfect in relation to anything I've done. So the talk today has been a marvellous introduction, really, to what I'm going to talk about, because I want to open up the debate about what Area 10 does, rostral prefrontal cortex does, and what I entirely agree with the aspects about self-judgment and confidence. There's a lot more that Area 10 does. I don't really need to be. I'll skip through these because I know that this particular audience knows this very well. There might be people subsequently watching the video who don't so much. But of course, this is a massive brain region. In fact, it's about 30 cubic centimeters of cortex. It's absolutely huge, and these are one of these staggering types of statistics. 4 kilometers of axonal cable. There are different regions, very probably within Area 10. Of course, different anatomists think about make different distinctions, but probably it's not just one region. Bigger in humans than in any other animal, and the structure of it is different in terms of density. And some people, Katerina, for instance, have argued that this represents some kind of evolutionary process specific to humans. It also develops extremely late in the human brain, and then having developed through childhood, it seems to change at an inordinate rate through adulthood as well. So this is aged 20 to 40, collaboration with some some collaborators of mine in India, where we were looking at the differences, changes in this part of the brain in terms of volume relative to the rest of the part of the brain in people with first episode schizophrenia versus people who are healthy. And you see a dramatic decrease in the volume of this region as you age from 20 to 40 in healthy people. And in the first episode schizophrenics, you saw an absence of this. So there's a possibility that, in fact, this aging process, having developed late and then losing early, this is part of a normal developmental process that you have to go through, and it provides you actually perhaps with a protection factor. Okay, so here are some of the, just some of the rostral functions that have been associated with rostral prefrontal cortex. And of course, I could have added, confidence judgments and so forth, but I didn't need to. I could add many more. These are just the ones that I could give about an hour's talk or more on every single one of them. Clearly, I'm not going to do that today. And I haven't got a very clever approach to this. I'm going to sort of start here, and I'm going to work through, and when Patrick waves his hand at me, I'm then going to stop. I'm going to drive myself into the ground. Okay, so let's start off with multitasking. Obviously, this started a long time ago for me, back with my PhD, in fact, back in the 1980s. And I was trying to solve a particular type of problem, which is why it is that some people with brain damage can come to the clinic and pass every test that was available at that time, and nearly all of them are available now, and have unimpaired IQ. In fact, their IQ can be very high, and superior memory, perception, language, action, everything really absolutely fine, but be really quite impaired in everyday life. And the way that we characterized this was by taking people shopping and observing what they do. And we found that people with these 3 cases that we reported, despite being unimpaired on every clinical test that was available at the time, would show dramatic impairment in everyday life, organisation. They wander up and down the street, apparently aimlessly. They would go into shops and do curious things, and generally take roughly about twice as long as people without brain damage who are matched for IQ, and they would end up with about half as many items. So there are now various versions of this. This test turned out to be quite clinically useful, and so there are various versions around the world, and people are taking people shopping as a way of investigating the way the brain functions. Now, at the time, we didn't know, because these were brain injuries, we didn't know which was the critical part of the brain. That took another 10 years of studying sort of multitasking type tests, where what we're trying to do is, in the lab, create some of the demands of these multitasking tests in the real world. So you've got many different tasks to carry out within a certain time, and there are certain rules that you have to follow in doing them. So the tasks themselves can be very easy. It's just about how you organize yourself. And what we found, as I say, it took 10 years to collect this data because isolated lesions involving rostral prefrontal cortex are quite rare, so these are tumors. We found that people with damage to this region of the brain, rostral prefrontal cortex, in this case on the left, were impaired on carrying out what they intended to do, even though they would plan and recount what they'd done and remember the task rules just as well as everybody else. This finding has been replicated a couple of times since in a couple of more sort of heroic efforts, including a collaboration, of course, with Etienne. And so this looks to be a fairly secure association between damage to this region and impairments in sort of multitasking type tests. Now, at this point, I need to make a clarification. There are different types of multitasking. What psychologists usually talk about when they talk about multitasking or multiple task performance is where somebody has said, please do these 3 tests at the same time, and somebody tries to do that. There is a different, that's called concurrent multitasking. There is a different type of multitasking I'm claiming, which is serial multitasking, which is where you have a series of tasks to do in a set time or in a set way, perhaps, to be most effective. And but you can only do one of the tasks at a time. So most of them, so prepare a steak and clean the floor, for instance. So you could type whilst making a phone call. You probably couldn't prepare a steak and clean the floor at the same time. And in fact, this type of multitasking in everyday life is probably more common. It depends what you call multitasking here. So walking and talking, an extreme case, could be considered concurrent multitasking perhaps, but most people don't actually think of multitasking in that way. But most of it, like cooking or caring for the kids whilst doing something else, tends to be this form. And these make different demands because you need to activate an intention after a delay period with this particular form. So, and in fact, a landmark study by Etienne back in 1999, of course, showed that activations when people are performing this type of multitasking test where you've got to remember something over a period of time and then it's useful at the future point, as opposed to doing a dual task type paradigm where you're carrying out 2 things consciously at the same time, activate different parts of the brain, and it's the branching, as he called it, but it later sort of became multitasking, which is presumably partly because there's no French word for multitasking. So branching must have sounded like, it's probably in some ways a better term. But we're really talking about a very similar thing here. And so what he showed here was that this is more than just trying to do a set of tasks at a time. And that leads us to prospective memory, because this is the component of remembering to do something at a future time. Okay? And of course, we've got experts in prospective memory in the audience here, which is great. So I don't need to labour this too much. Here is a typical type of paradigm you use. People are classifying words as either 4 or 6 letters long, and that's your ongoing task, what you do during the delay period or retention period. And then in the prospective memory condition, you'll be doing that task, and for instance, if one of the words is, let's say, an animal word, then you would press a different key. So that's the sort of, and I should say, we tend to use in my lab conjunction type designs where we create tasks which use different types of stimuli when you're asked different types of questions. But I suppose it's supposedly isomorphic for the process of interest, and then you look at what's true across them to get an idea about what's relevant to a class of tasks rather than any particular one that you invent. And what we found, and this has sort of kind of become the standard finding in prospective memory, is you get lateral activations in area 10 during the period where you're remembering the intention, and you get higher activations in the medial aspects of area 10 during the ongoing task. Okay, so that tends to decrease when you're maintaining an attention. This has been found in nearly every study that's been conducted so far where the contrast has been carried out. We've recently managed to complete another 10-year collection of data and look at this type of task in lesion cases, and sure enough found almost exact replication in patients with lesions as well. That's very pleasing. This is just to say that, okay, I've given you a sort of brief introduction. There's a lot of stuff we now know or think we know about prospective memory. I reviewed this in 2011, but there are, for instance, Sam Gilbert would happily be able to tell you things now that aren't on here. So the area has progressed, given that 20 years or so ago, there was virtually nobody knew what prospective memory was, and we certainly didn't know what brain areas were critical for it. This has been a great growth area, a real success story, I think, for neuroscience. So XN control, this will be something that you probably don't know what that means. So that's a construct, an invented construct that we kind of use as a shorthand for something. And this is trying to explain what is going on. Well, it emerged out of the studies of multitasking and prospective memory, trying to understand what's the underlying process, perhaps. Because obviously those prospective memory is defined by a situation that you put somebody in, not a particular process. So the simple idea here was that maybe what was happening in prospective memories, you need to maintain something over a period of time, so it's maintaining a thought in your head. You also have to interact with the environment in detecting the target. So maybe the contribution that rostral prefrontal cortex is making is some kind of gating mechanism deciding between these two modes of attending. So the jargon is that stimulus-oriented attending is when you're attending to something in the world. Stimulus-independent attending is attending to the thoughts in your head. And the reason it's called XN attending is it's exogenous attention that is required to do stimulus-oriented attending, and endogenous attention for stimulus-independent for XN. XN attending being the general process of either thinking about thoughts, maintaining thoughts in your head or manipulating them, or alternatively sort of shutting down that kind of gateway and thinking of attending to stimuli in the world instead. So the gateway hypothesis is quite simple. It's just that rostral prefrontal cortex supports a mechanism which is involved with this, specifically when you need to do these attending modes more than you normally do. Okay, and this is just a cartoon to remind me. This was the original theory. It doesn't really, none of these things, it's just an idea. But it's here to remind me to tell you that I don't think that in this respect that Area 10 is doing anything particularly complicated. One doesn't need to suppose that it's doing anything complicated in terms of processes or representations. It could, in fact, speaks to Patrick's introduction at the beginning. It could just be a very simple signal attenuation. It has a massive effect, knock-on effect in terms of what we do, but it doesn't have to be a complicated thing at all. So we tested this hypothesis that rostral prefrontal cortex was involved in this by inventing tasks which measure this ability to maintain thoughts in your head versus attend to the world. So here, for instance, let's imagine that this is a football pitch-sized figure, and you are walking your way around it, and you have to decide at each junction, is that a left or a right turn? Okay, so periodically you can work with the stimulus on the screen, or alternatively, the stimulus can be replaced by a thought bubble, and you have to carry on doing the task in your head. And what you do across this class of tasks, if you do that kind of thing, is that you see, sure enough, lateral activations in rostral prefrontal cortex. During the time, either you're switching between these modes or you're maintaining a thought in your head. And you see medial activations, by contrast, when you're working with a stimulus you can see. And we've done a series of studies now, and again, I'm going to whip through them really. This take-home point is that there are effects with behavior in medial prefrontal cortex, so these are not independent of behavior there. And these activations don't really matter too much what it is that you're doing. So this whole class of tasks shows this general principle. We're not the only person to find this. Hensler and colleagues have done a very clever study where they took the principles of the hypothesis and then invented their own tasks that looked nothing like the ones that we had used, and saw whether they got similar results, and sure enough, they did. So that was very pleasing, and well done to them for taking the courage to actually test a hypothesis rather than replicate just a paradigm. So the question is, what's underlying these kind of things? Does XN control, is this playing some part in these other types of process that's going on? Has it got some explanatory value? Well, what we've done, for instance, is look at, so we're in a process of doing this. It's obviously a lengthy process because there are so many different things that are involved, that rostral prefrontal cortex is involved in. So we started with prospective memory, which seemed the closest link. And Roland Benoit created a paradigm. We're using this kind of figure here, where we had a manipulation of stimulus-oriented or stimulus-independent changes, and had a prospective memory intention, and crossed this in a sort of 2x2 type design. And what we find is that there is indeed great overlap in the regions that are activated when you're maintaining a thought in your head or doing, by contrast, the ongoing task, and those that are active when you are either doing the lateral, attending to the environment or attending to the thoughts in your head. So this is showing the overlap here in medial prefrontal cortex. So it looks as if, on the basis of this, that maybe this explanation, and in as much as fMRI data can tell you that this idea of switching attentional control, this control process, might be relevant to the findings we're getting with prospective memory. It is, however, it does not look like a good account whatsoever for another function of rostral prefrontal cortex, which is involved with mentalizing. This is a wonderful study by Sam Gilbert, where we're doing these kinds of switching tasks, but in one condition, the subjects were told, relying on the scanner, were told that a person who in the control room was either trying to be helpful or unhelpful by speeding up the trials, and they had to make judgments of whether the person in the control room was being helpful or not. And in other conditions, they were told that just the computer was randomly changing these things to be faster or slower, and they had to say whether overall it was going faster or slower than it had previously. And so you're contrasting that as the mentalizing manipulation. And we find actually the very different activations in the brain. So it doesn't look as if this XN attending control construct has very much to say about mentalizing at all. This is something else. So we're not the only ones to be taking this. This is, again, a very brave study, really, because they took the principle of this gateway hypothesis and made an implication for changes they could make to the way they presented stimuli and how much they would give, and then said, well, you know, if this hypothesis holds any water, then we should get similar activations to the Burgess group in prospective memory, even though we're not doing the kinds of manipulations that they were doing. And sure enough, they found exactly the same thing. So it's very nice that we're showing some relationship there, and other people are. And so it looks perhaps as if this kind of attending control mechanism has some relevance for this. And at this point, the area is sort of beginning to converge perhaps with experimental psychology studies of prospective memory. Thomas, of course, will know all about this, where really this is an ongoing debate about how much you can separate out maintaining thoughts in your head versus noticing things in the environment, and how these interact together. And so given that the fact that these two areas are developed completely separately, really, one from sort of patient work, almost by happenstance ending up this way, and experimental psychology, which is much more traditional, we're beginning to meet in the middle, which is very pleasing. Okay, mentalizing, not going to say a great deal about that at all. I'll just mention it in passing. This is Sam's meta-analysis, which shows that mentalizing activations tend to activate, across a range of studies, tend to activate regions slightly posterior to those involved in multitasking, for instance. And in fact, mentalizing is odd in the way that the regions of the brain that are generally coactive with rostral prefrontal cortex are fairly predictable for a range of types of different operations, such as episodic retrieval, but for mentalizing, it breaks the normal rules. So there's something very unusual about mentalizing, which we don't quite understand, but it doesn't seem to follow the same principles as other parts of Area 10, and it may be that this is a different part of Area 10, or maybe not even Area 10 at all. Initiation, well, I can cover this extremely quickly. Here's a clinical study I invented a long time ago. It's used around by neuropsychologists in clinics around the world now. It's very simple. You have two sections where you read a sentence to the patient. So if the old house will be torn, for instance, you have the last word missing and they have to give you the word as quickly as they can. So the old house will be torn down would be a very good response. The second section, this measures response initiation. The second section measures response suppression. Here you'll read the sentence again, the whole town came to their mayor, and they'll have to complete it with banana, for instance. As you can imagine, in some languages, the sentence structures are different, so it doesn't always work terribly well. Now, what we found out years ago was that patients with frontal lobe lesions can be paired at both sections, but independently from each other. And it's taken us a long time to gather us enough data to actually show why that is. And this is because there are different parts of prefrontal cortex supporting these performance on these different tasks, different sections of the task. And the straightforward initiation is impaired in lesions to Area 10. So again, Area 10, at least in some respects, is not doing something that looks terribly complicated in processing terms. It's doing something quite simple. And in fact, we looked on the basis of this. If this is true, then one should find across a range of studies studying lots of different functions, one should find a predictable relationship between activations in this region and reaction times. So here, what this is showing, this figure is showing, is if you take all the fMRI studies that we had available at that time that activated Area 10, regardless of what task was being done, and you look at the reaction time of the task that provoked Area 10 activation compared with that which was used as a contrast, and looked at the difference between them, activations that in the medial rostral prefrontal cortex tended to be where the task was being performed quicker than whatever the contrast was, and lateral ones tended to be tasks that were performed slower. So if you're getting Area 10 activations in your studies, think very carefully about the reaction times, how fast people are doing this. Okay? Now, obviously, in terms of where this came from was based on the gateway hypothesis, the idea that if you're doing stimulus-independent attending, you are less engaged by definition with the world. The world, being engaged with the world for fast reaction times requires you that circuit to be engaged, and so reaction times will tend to be slower. So that's one baseline, but that was just the hypothesis, really. I'm not even going to try and explain this. I'm just telling you that it's a thing. That's our idea of why it might be, but obviously these are early days yet. But you better look at your RTs, your action times, if you're doing this kind of study. Okay, temporal discounting. So this is looking at prospection rather than prospective memory. So looking at future thinking. And this is a fun growth area recently for rostral prefrontal cortex. If I asked you, would you rather have £1 now or £1,000 tomorrow? Well, is there anybody who wouldn't take the £1,000 tomorrow? No, and you're all academics, so you're quite future-oriented people according to the personality stereotypes of academics, so you would going to go for that. Now, if I offered you £499.99 now, or euros, or 500 in 10 years, is there anybody who wouldn't take the money now? Okay, good, okay. So all of us fall along those kinds of dimension. This is a kind of individual differences thing. It measures how much we are future-oriented. So amazingly, across a population, some people seem to be consistently now people. They don't like waiting for things at all, and they really devalue a reward by having to wait. And other people are very future-oriented, including, it appears, most members of my research group. They'll wait inordinate lengths of time just to get £1 more, I'll happily come back in 2 years to get that extra pound. So some people are off the scale, actually, in my own lab. Including myself, I had to throw myself out as an outlier. So anyway, most people are much more sort of rational about these kinds of discounting. And you can use this to measure individual differences in the scanner by getting people to imagine future scenarios. And what we did here was look at how, by getting people to richly imagine future scenes, how much it changed whether they were a now person or a future person. And remarkably, we found that you could change people quite a lot, in particular those, the less future-oriented people, the more now people, as measured by, there's a consideration of future consequences scale that personality psychologists use, where you've got items like, I'm willing to sacrifice my immediate happiness or well-being in order to choose future outcomes, whether you endorse that or not. And a set of other items describes how much of a now person you are. These people were, their choices were altered in this kind of situation by being encouraged to think very richly about the future scenario. We hope that this might have some message for instance, medication compliance and smoking and public health type things. But that's a whole story in itself. These studies, it's sort of a collection mini meta-analysis here, shows that again we're getting consistent rostral prefrontal cortex activation, where you get people to imagine future scenarios. Okay, so overall, the question really has been about how much time have I got? Because I can.
Another 3 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, right. Maybe I'll have a chance to say something else. So the question is really about, for at the moment, is one of the strands we're following is whether this attending control can explain these types of phenomena. And it looks like it might do it for these, really, that we've looked at for multitasking, prospective memory initiation. It doesn't for mentalizing, and I have no idea about these other aspects at all at this stage. I'll see if I can find. Oh yes, so here's another. You get medial activation. This is self-judgment. So really going out of the normal realms of, because we like to think, because we're specialists in control, we like to think about control. But in fact, area 10 tends to crop up in things which don't look like control things. They look more problems. They look more like sort of self-perception items. So if I ask you whether these adjectives describe your personality, for instance, and you make that judgment, and you think about, for instance, another person you know, amazingly, you get activations in a large section of rostral prefrontal cortex with these kinds of judgments, and the amount of activation you can get can be related to the similarity between how you perceive the other person and yourself. Time perception, for instance, is an interesting one. This is one of the first phenomena that was ever picked up in relation to rostral prefrontal cortex by Arsanath Petrie back in 1952. And she was, I think, was the very first person ever to carry out what might be thought as a rostral prefrontal cortex investigation. And she noticed that there was something looking at people who are undergoing leucotomies, either for using a posterior procedure or anterior procedure. She noticed that one of the things that people were noticing who had undergone the rostral procedure, but not the posterior one, was that they said the passage of time seemed altered to them now. Sometimes it seemed to go fast, sometimes it seemed to go slow. So we looked at this in a lesion study by getting people to estimate durations of time by counting and then having to, so they would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, using alongside a screen that was appearing on, a display that was appearing on a screen. And then the display would stop and they'd have to maintain this sequence in their head. And we had 2 durations, either a short duration one or second, then they did a longer duration one. And what we found was that Petrie was absolutely right. Even with simple tasks like that, you get patients with BA10 active involvement tend to show impairments, but they don't show impairments for the short duration one, so it's not that they can't maintain a sequence. It's somehow when you switch it to a long duration one. So the question is, why is this? Maybe it's mind wandering with the longer duration, which is one possibility we've investigating recently, or it might be something to do with adjusting to the different location. We're wondering actually whether it's mind wandering, because so it looks like there's indifferent. So the gateway hypothesis might make you think that this is quite a simple mechanism of switching one way or another. So if you're mind wandering, it has an impact on, for instance, you wouldn't get distracted so much by external stimuli. It doesn't seem as simple as that, because if you look at individuals, so some individuals seem to be sort of twitchy gait individuals, the high switch individuals. So they're prone to mind wandering, and they're also prone to being distracted by things in everyday life. Other people are quite good at maintaining sort of mild control gait. They are very good at maintaining thoughts in their head, or maintaining attending to the world. So it's not as simple as it's either or. But there's a complicator there that is that these two groups of individuals seem to show different relationships according to what the distraction in the everyday world is. So if the distraction in the everyday world is something relevant to the task, then you get the low switch individuals are more impaired, and if it's something that's not relevant, so for instance white noise, you get the high switch individuals tend to show a relationship with mind wandering, and not the low switch. So it's quite a complicated aspect. Analogical reasoning. Should I finish? I could go on, but I'll spare you. Analogical reasoning. Okay, so here's a good. There is many ways in which the study of area 10, this is a point of caution, has wrong-footed the scientific community over the last few years. Well, there's a whole story about that. So one of them is, for instance, that when people started to notice area 10 activations across a range of tasks, the explanations that came out about what area 10 was doing were not like those that I was forming, or Etienne was forming, for instance, or Stephen has been arguing. They were saying, well, since we're seeing activations across a range of different types of tasks, this must be something to do with intelligence, for instance, or working memory, some construct that would be evolved across a range of things. Now that turned out, that's of course not true, because you can pretty much excise the whole of area 10 and not affect performance on IQ tests. So we were wrong-footed really by not considering the totality of the data. Here's another way in which we were wrong-footed. So very early on in studies of analogical reasoning, neuroimaging studies, people found in the analogical reasoning part, area 10 activations. And so the association was made between this region and the processes involved in carrying over analogies and applying analogies, principles from one situation to another. But in fact, when Emmanuelle Voll looked at, she not only scanned the, obviously in an analogical reasoning task, you have a source where you extract a principle, and then you have a target period where you map that principle. What she actually found was, and what she did that people hadn't done before, was not only scan the target period where you're applying the principle, but looked at what area 10 was doing just when you were shown the source period, before you knew how you would apply this or anything like that. Before you could possibly know what the principle was. And she found activations during that source period just as much before you even see the target as during the point where you're applying it. So it wasn't just true that area 10 was involved when you're doing the actual analogical reasoning. It was something at an earlier stage where you're kind of preparing, perhaps considering what the possibilities are, or just preparing your attending a situation for it. Okay, let's go back and make sure that I just show a picture of the millions of people involved. Thank you very much.